G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day and so far that you are having a brilliant week. Now of course, as always legends, we do have a lot to go over. And there's a lot that we do need to speak about, and we need to push back on some of the current narratives suggesting that any offensive action has run out of steam. And I'm seeing this more and more, titles, thumbnails, whatever, and we're going to push back on that a little bit today because I'm actually going to show you some data, and you cannot take 1 or 2 days, extrapolate that out at a linear or constant rate and go, well, this is the situation on the battlefield. I'm going to show you today in hard data why the front line is moving 4 or more times faster than it was at similar points last year and is still increasing in speed. We're going to talk about the reality of attritional nature of the battlefield of the front line, talk about strategic reserves, a shift in tactics. We also need to add some relative numbers as well that are trying to create a pseudo environment of informational warfare and talk about, well, how bad is something really that is occurring. Of course, I'll show you the maps. There's some very important shifts actually on the maps. I actually believe today, in the past month, today's probably the most important shifts that I've seen on the map, so we'll put that in the very beginning. But where I'll start with is with these overnight strikes. Now, overnight, we know there's strikes all the time, and I don't talk about it that much unless it is something significant. And Ukraine, they carried out a series of strikes into Crimea and Donetsk. Now, there are reports the headquarters of Russia's 8th Guards Combined Armed Army was destroyed along with dozens of officers. But you know what I think about any claims like this. But I'm not interested in that bit. The bit that I'm finding interesting is it's rumoured that Ukraine has used for the first time in combat a domestically produced cruise missile. Now, this is unconfirmed, and even when in this war things are confirmed, well, I always take everything with an absolute grain of salt. We see it in the air, but we have seen for many, many months and over years things like domestic cruise missiles and whatever looking to enter the fold, and it's been any day now for some time. It'll be interesting to see if that is the case and to what quantity Ukraine can bring that into the fold. Because as I've said, the biggest problem that I see with the Ukrainian forces from the air to the front line to everything isn't quality, it's quantity, it's mass. And overall, I'll say I believe that is the massive concern for me in Western militaries through the globe, is bringing mass to bear and industry to back that as well. So keep an eye out for that. But we're going to now have a look on the maps and exactly what I spoke about in the beginning of very important bits and pieces and data that disproves the headlines. So here is Ukraine in the centre of your screen. The red areas occupied since 2022, the purple since 2014, and the red check on this map, ground that Russia has made over the past 24 hours. So let me show you this data. Now what we do is at the end of every month, we wrap up the kilometre squares that have been made or lost. Now, this isn't the full month of June yet. We're still waiting on an update. It will probably come tonight, and I'll update you with that tomorrow. But this makes my point regardless, is what we can see is it's another 60 kilometre squares greater than May. So it's still growing in speed as well. Now, again, what we're working off is just the deep state numbers. Now, we know there's a level of error in this, but what I'm assuming is the level of error is probably similar month to month, if that makes sense. We'll wait on AMK and Syriac and we'll see, try and get a happy medium of where this number is sitting, but we can see that it's growing. Now, the more surprising part to me is, remember at the start of June, I said June 23, June 24 seems to be an outlier of very small gains. So let's then step back to June 24. And what we have is 108 kilometre squares. Now, what we can see is this is significantly larger this month than last year. Now, why do I show you both of these figures? Well, as I always say, the way you present data, that is just as important as the data itself, because I could take this number right here of 40 kilometre squares back in January 24 and go, well, it's going to take 1,000 years before Russia gets to X area. That is a way of presenting data. Would that be false? No. Is it interpretation of data to fit a narrative? Yes. The reason I show you both these numbers is to try and move around there. So this is showing momentum on the front line, that it's still growing, and that this figure behind this one is showing similar weather conditions year on year, okay? And of course, that matters a lot for ground movement. So still gains on the front line. But more so than that, some very important movements as well. Now, let's just zoom in on the map, and we're going to ignore this red check for now, because if this is correct, this is a the largest of concern of movements that I've seen for a long time. We have this Seversk front. Now, what we know is for well over a year, there was like no movements on this at all. In the past couple of weeks, we've seen some slight movements in geolocations as well. We've even heard that Russian commanders talk about how good the Ukrainian defense is in here. But as we know, as attritional nature of war continues, the front line needs to be thinned out to move troops in other areas. Therefore, you could see the heavily defended areas start moving. And that is what is being suggested around Seversk. So there's no changes on this map today. But let's bring up then the Syriac map. Now, what he's suggesting is two movements. Serebrenka, that the Russians are in the center of this. Not super interested in that. We know the grey zone is moving in that. But the more so is this movement. We have this reservoir here towards Seversk, and him saying 1.6 kilometers away from the first blocks, which is basically dead on 1 mile away. So right out in here from Verkhonomayansky, and that is a significant shift if this is correct, moving up onto here. And remember about, I want to say 3 weeks ago, I showed you footage of Russian FABs impacting the very first buildings on this. And I said, we may see that because if the Russians are going to make a step from Verkhonomayansky to Seversk, we will need to see them massively suppress any of those positions on that. And we saw those FABs hammering those areas. And now we have claims of this stepping up. Again, take it with a grain of salt until we get geolocations or multiple maps suggesting it, but this is of huge concern being on this front line. And let's just do a couple of measurements to see, look, it's close enough to there. We're talking 4 kilometers behind the line, which isn't uncommon for this map to be up to 4 kilometers incorrect. And yeah, around about a mile to those first blocks that we saw getting hammered by some of those Russian tactical aviation bombs. So keep a very close eye on this front, and I will as well. So then let's move our way back down to Velika Novosilka at a very important update as well. Now, yes, ignore for now the 5 axes here of red check, because I don't believe it looks like that, not in this nature of war. But I want to show you Dashne. Now, this checked line here, this, of course, if we zoom out a little bit more, you can get a better idea. This is Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. Of course, where we know there's been minor incursions into here, but nothing major. Of course, informational loss. But the border of this oblast here, it comes down the Volga River here, which we thought may work as a physical water barrier to stop movement in on this axis. But it doesn't appear that way. Now, we know there has been targeting of some of the bridges across here, but still, there is presence, absolutely, of Russian forces at this intersection here in Dashne. Entering for the first time, like really entering and seizing, holding terrain in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. But also, have a look at the footage, have a look at the quality of the defensive lines here that are being lost with relatively little resistance. So we're looking for 26 seconds and 47 seconds in this footage. So let's have a look here. Now, I want to come just before this because you can see on the drone footage, you can see this defensive line. You can see where we are in Dashne as well. We've come up and you can see the quality and the effort that has gone into a defensive position like this. With what I'm seeing, I'm not talking no resistance, but not the resistance that you would think given the resources that have gone into creating something like this. And then we step up to 40, I'm too far, 47 in here. And in this part of the footage, put it on the Telegram if you'd like, you can see then presence forces in this area around Dashne as well, right out to about here. And of course, we've spoken about this waterway maybe not working as the barrier that we thought, although there has been some targeting of forces moving across this bridge. Now, let's have a look here. We can see that on 5 different axes from Shevchenko, Vilnopole, Fyodorivka, Yalta, Zerka, Zelenikut areas in here. Now, what do I think this looks like? In my opinion, my understanding of attritional nature of war, it's not going to look like these 2 fingers coming out. Yes, that may be the primary axis, but it's grinding forward. And at this area in here, that's likely red. A couple of bits. The red check doesn't interest me that much on this map. It's actually the grey zone today. So we have this Pidubne, I think it's pronounced in here, of grey zone right up into here, as well as grey zone on this map heading into this Voskresenka as well. So if we step back to yesterday, you can see the grey zone largely shift. I wouldn't be surprised if we see And then now that we in Australia at least have entered July, and people are going to meet us here in a little bit, it's still pretty early in the morning here, that we see these gains come to not show the kilometre squares through June. And we may see this all turn into red. So let's have a look on the Syriac map and have a look at where this is showing differently. Now, of course, we can zoom in on here. We can see this area. This is Dashnay right in here, as well as some movement just to the north of Oleksivkia. And a lot of this area, this is pushing right up in and around to just the south of Hodorkovy in here. Wait out on that. It's not super concerning at the moment as far as tactical movements turning into strategic actions like the entry into Dnipropetrovsk and around this area, closing up multiple axes to become then one large game. What we can look, though, and see is where things are lining up. So they're saying that along the Vulture all the way up to Zherkov, that this is all one piece, which is what we'd expect. But also we can confirm this western push from Fyririvkia right in here as well. So we know that has then occurred. And then further movements around from Shevchenko, Velny Pole, further exploiting that too. And this is what I've been saying for a number of weeks, is you're going to start seeing where these different axes, so we had the axes of Zelny Pole, Shevchenko, Yalta, and Pokrovsk, we're going to start seeing these somewhat meet up, and then we're going to see large exploitations of ground coming. So let's stay in here and then talk about Pokrovsk. And we have no changes on this map, but look at Novomykolaiv, an area of which Syriac has said the Russians have had some presence for some time. So today, right in here, there's a road that runs north-south, and it's just this northern block. So right in here, we can see that at 1 minute and 13, we can see that a Russian flag has gone up there. If we skip further in the footage, this is the flag that we are talking about. So again, I think we're going to see movement into Dnipropetrovsk Oblast on multiple areas at very similar times. Now, Pokrovsk as well, we have a Syriac map update. Look for Shevchenko just in here. It's just a minor update out of here. Now, of course, there's multiple Shevchenkos, but just in here, we still see this just then moving forward little by little as we go. Now, we'll come into the south and then we'll go into the north. So yesterday I showed you a geolocation coming across into Kamyanskaya. Let's have a look here. We can see that Syriac is showing that. Let's see, did the grey zone actually shift on this map? No, it did not, at least from what I'm looking at. But then let's move into the north, as there's a lot of talk around Sumy that there is up to 50,000 Russian soldiers in here ready to start pushing. Again, with any of these numbers, remember when there was 80,000 in Kursk? Remember there was 80,000 in here, and all this informational war is a huge part of this as well. But of course, this is where Ukraine pushed into Kursk, but they weren't able to flick that switch on and off again, that it remains on when you open up an offensive. And what it has done is it has pushed back into this sector, which has always been a concern here. And now the Russians are occupying around 210 square kilometres at a very minimum from this map. So let's look at what Wall Street Journal has said, talking with, of course, Commander Syrskyi around here. They're saying in the opposite direction towards Sumy, there's 50,000 troops in the area. And Syrskyi is saying their main strategy is to wear us down with their numbers. Yes, that is the strategy of attritional warfare. Over the past year, the front line has grown by 100 miles. That leaves Ukrainian commanders playing whack-a-mole, sending its elite units to help plug gaps. This is exactly why we said that Kursk never made sense. If you are numerically inferior, you have smaller numbers, what you do not want to do is lengthen the front line. If you are the larger force, you've got more numbers, you may look to lengthen the front line. That's why we said in tactics, it looked like Kursk was actually helping the Russians in a way of thinning out, because yes, it thins out everyone, but if you have less figures, it thins you out further. And this is where we've seen what it's become. And this is basically the Brusilov offensive, attritional nature, protracted war we've spoken about, of you push in multiple sectors and it's thin everywhere. And to quote this, then you leave Ukrainian commanders playing whack-a-mole of stabilising here. You stabilise this and then it pushes here. And this is exactly what I said yesterday. Sumy seems to have stabilised in the past maybe week. But what isn't now stable? Well, Pokrovsk isn't stable, South isn't stable, Zversk isn't stable. So what we may see is then these units, like they say here, that then commando units have to get sent to stabilise location. Okay, so they get sent down to Zversk to stabilise it. What does Russia do? They push back on Sumy. Brusilov offensive, multiple axes, 101 of style of warfare like this. I'm not surprised to see that at all. You and I have gone through the doctrine right around this pushing in multiple areas and create chaos somewhere, stabilise, create chaos somewhere else. Exactly what I said when Kursk opened. The best tactic here for the Russians would be just to push harder in the east, because you're going to need to have troops draw down. This gentleman, commander of their Special Forces unit, said, now we're looking for ways to conduct our own assaults and push back in these areas. Their numbers are the big problem for us, although they say it's not enough to overrun. The enemy, they're losing 300 to 400 people a day, he suggests, but they can deal with a lot of casualties. They keep bringing in reserves. And this is something we hear a lot of the Ukrainian forces say, is they just keep bringing in so many people. And this is what you get when you're recruiting 30,000 a month. This gentleman, a 25-year-old platoon commander, has said it is the cruelest fight I've been in. They were attacking with infantry, drones, grenade launchers, machine guns, RD clusters, everything. We never had more than 5-minute break while we're regrouping. And to go back to what Sursky is saying, to wear us down by the numbers, is this may have stabilised, but let's not act like the fight isn't on, with like this gentleman saying the cruelest fight here. And the nature of attritional warfare is to attrit, not to then gain ground. You gain ground through attritional nature. Now, what we speak about a lot is informational warfare, pseudo-environments, which is you create something that is truth given the information that is available, and therefore withholding certain information. And this, I think, is a good example of that. So let's have a look at this. And this is from the UK Ministry of Defence, their intelligence briefing. Intel update. Russian independent news media's own reports that Russian courts received 20,500 cases of personnel going AWOL. And this isn't whataboutism. This is where we need to be relative to give an idea to how severe is this number. And this is where you set that pseudo environment of going, well, this is true. Russia has AWOL problem. But if you only ever give one number to this, you set a pseudo environment truth that is, they are the only ones suffering this, and therefore it is catastrophic. Now, before we step forward, remember, Russia's population is around 4 times the size, using mostly volunteers at the moment instead of conscripts. And this is where there's been pushback from even pages like Ukraine Control Map of, look at Ukraine's AWOL numbers. They're replying to this. We're very supportive of Ukraine, but crossing a bike, it's diabolical there. So we have this of 20,000 trying to talk about how, runs counter the narrative, blah, blah, blah. And then we look at the DW article this gentleman shared, saying at the start of the year, Ukraine had registered about 123,000 investigations into soldiers going absent without leave or deserting their units. Okay, so 6 times higher than that figure? Now, what we know is this figure is likely much, much worse. We do know that commanders, they're not reporting and logging this because they say, well, it's just adding more admin for me. If they want to leave, I don't want them on the front line anyway. And even if they do, you're only then having investigations, criminal actions brought on your second time. So there's rumour that the real figure, well, I've heard figures up to 500,000. I don't believe it's that high, but there's rumours that the real figure likely is 2 to 3 times higher than actually what is stated above. This isn't whataboutism. It's giving a realistic perspective to how severe this number actually is. Okay? So let's give more of the reality of attritional nature of war and how the media and the bloggers and everyone is slowly turning around to see, I guess, the reality of what is happening. From this Financial Times article, NATO summit cannot disguise Ukraine's plight. Now, talk about the NATO meeting the other day. First, NATO has refocused on its key mission, which is the deterrence of Russia. Now, I disagree with this. NATO's key mission officially is collective defence. That's officially their key mission, and they don't state a country or who that is against. It is collective defence. Against anyone, it's collective defence. Now, of course, that was developed for collective defence against the Soviet Union, but from a realist lens, it's far more complex than this, and NATO's mission for Estonia or Lithuania or America or Germany is significantly different. For the US, it is not about that. For the US, it is a mechanism of power projection. If the US doesn't have this, they have no power projection into Europe. This is what I've said. Trump can say and jump up and down all he wants about leaving NATO. He's not going to do it because then the US is just an isolated, incredibly powerful and rich island, but with no influence in these areas. It is power projection into Europe and parts of Asia, okay? And as well, containment it was containment of the Soviets, and now it's become containment of then Russian actions as well. But it's very different for a country like a small European state to like America with power projection and legitimizing nations and containment militaries as well. Okay, so in this he talks about that there has been a recovery of Zelensky and Trump's relationship after what happened in the White House back in February. And he says, but while things are going better for Ukraine diplomatically, the war itself seems to be going worse. Some NATO leaders fear that the situation on the front line could deteriorate seriously by this autumn. That would be far more significant than any paper commitments made in last week's NATO communique. To quote Big Serge, the battlefield is the first principle and the ultimate repository of political power. And this is war is politics by other means, Clausewitzian 101. And I say that bloggers and leaders, they can ignore the reality on the battlefield as much as they would like, but eventually it will absolutely come to the forefront. But deteriorate seriously by autumn, okay? What we did see is, remember when the head of intelligence, Budanov, allegedly said if there is no serious negotiations by the summer, then very dangerous processes for the very existence of Ukraine may begin. Now, this was denied after, and there was an investigation launched into that. But we are sort of to the start of summer. We'll see what occurs over the next coming months, but it does look like it could deteriorate seriously. Now, military assessments suggest that both Russian and Ukrainian militaries are nearing the point of exhaustion. But while Russia can probably keep up the current levels of operations for another year, Ukraine may reach a breaking point within 6 months if it does not receive significant new military support. Is that not contradictory? To say they're both nearing the point, one has a couple of months and one has a year. Meanwhile, NATO is saying that by 2030, Russia will be significantly more powerful than it is now and will threaten the great NATO states as far as like Germany and France, okay? That's why they're suggesting that they are next. And it's lacing this with positivity, positivity throughout to give, to make it palatable for some audiences, I guess. Now, following the positive Zelensky-Trump meeting, there are hopes that Ukraine may receive fresh supplies of Patriots and HIMARS as their air defence is stretched thin. But there's still this idea that there's going to be an offensive military solution to this war, not attritional, make it costly, seek the best deal that you can. But there are also some shortfalls. In particular, Ukrainian troop numbers that the country's Western allies cannot fix. Russia is now thought to have lost more than 1 million troops killed, wounded in the conflict, but Ukrainian losses have also been heavy, and Russia's population is about 4 times larger than Ukraine's. From all the figures we're seeing in this, that the loss would have to be 4 times, and I've even said Zelensky's figures that he has spoken about don't suggest that attrition is in Ukraine's favour at all. Neither do anything like UA losses or Media Zone where they're actually like taking obituaries and everything. Nothing suggests this. And to link into this one above of these are defensive or offensive strategic weapons like HIMARS, but only infantry can seize and hold and recover ground. The other assets are there just to make it more costly or assist in that, okay? The increased intensity of Russian missile attacks on Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities is also damaging Ukrainian morale without a clear vision of victory or at least of an end to the war. A sense of hopelessness risks descending over the country, and we're seeing this in some of these figures as well, which are climbing. A change in mood inside Ukrainian government is reflected in the urgency with which it is now privately calling for a ceasefire. A year or two ago, such calls would have been regarded as defeatism. Now they are made with increasing insistence in closed-door meetings between Ukrainian and Western leaders. But this thing is, there's these calls, but demanding the same terms or terms only that are beneficial to Ukraine in these. It's not going to take place. And as we have suggested, I think a lot of the Russian command can smell blood in the water. They're looking at some of these figures. They're looking at this complete 180-degree shift on calling now for ceasefire, when no one would even have suggested that 12 months ago. And I think that is blood in the water. And again, it may even lead to, well, no, we will keep going. Now, there is little belief among European policymakers that Russia is in any mood to agree to a ceasefire. One well-placed official thinks that Russia's central goal is now to capture Odessa. And Odessa would be catastrophic. Of course, Odessa is down in here. Militarily, it is a stretch. It is very, very difficult to cross any bodies of water without severe degradation of the opposing side's forces. But again, we will see. Maybe there is goal of that, but that is, in my opinion, still years away, even with the current rates. A group of former European leaders, including Carl Bildt of Sweden and Sanna Marin of Finland, visited Ukraine recently and picked up on the deteriorating mood. They wrote afterwards, while Ukrainians will never stop resisting, without more military support, Ukraine can lose more territory. The problem is, what can't be fixed is manpower. More cities, it can be fixed if NATO and all these, if NATO and all these actually go and sign up. It would actually be fixed. More cities might be captured. Off the record, some Western officials are even bleaker, warning of a risk of a catastrophic failure if the Ukrainian military is stretched to breaking point, does not receive significant increase in military and financial aid from its Western allies. Again, no matter how much goes in, you still need to influence the problem in troop numbers positively. Now, more aid, military, financial can help that. How much in a short period of time, we will see. Of course, wars are unpredictable and moods can shift. But as I call it, the oil tanker of attrition. Attritional nature of war is like trying to turn an oil tanker. Once you've got momentum going one way, it actually becomes more and more predictable. But again, things can always shift greatly. The optimists argue that Ukrainians' expertise in drone warfare has made it impossible for large groups of Russian troops to advance en masse. They also argue that even if Russia breaks through Ukrainian lines, it lacks the mechanised divisions to capitalise on the achievement. Put an asterisk in the mechanised divisions for now. But of course, drones have made a lot of movement much, much more difficult. Also, very true. The received wisdom has been proved wrong many times before this war. But if the growing pessimism among the following Ukraine war closely is justified, then any feel-good sentiments generated by the NATO summit may soon disappear. And it is getting to, and has been at a significant turning point for some time. And you don't know where that turning point is until you are well past it. And again, like I stated in one of maybe slide 2, was Europe is still very positive that there will be a military victory solution and recapture of all of these areas, or a negotiation of which has no bearing on the front line at all, like the ceasefire that was proposed that would only benefit Ukraine and would have nothing to do with Russia's real position on the battlefield. Now, let's talk about strategic reserve and where the mood and the reporting from Europe has changed hugely on Russia's industry and ability for future operations too. And there's some there are some outtakes from this article titled War in Ukraine, but where have the Russian tanks gone? And tanks for many, many years, they were used as a barometer for how long Russia had left. So they've got this many tanks, they're losing this many per day, and on this date they will not be able to fight. But now we see the relevance of main battle tanks has reduced significantly, and this measurement has been largely forgotten. The battlefield drives innovation and change, and this has then forced adoption and adaptation to light vehicles. But also, we do know that the media, the bloggers, the politicians, they suggested that Russia couldn't change and adapt, nor did they have the industry to replace any of this. Now we see it changing to, well, they are producing 4 times as much as NATO, and now we see Ukraine adapting to then the Russian attack tactics of motorcycle warfare. We see the Russians using that for a number of months, and now more every single day I go on Twitter, there's a Ukrainian ex-brigade is now training on light vehicles. And I'm like, well, I'm waiting for people to eat their own words. Now, this has then been translated. I've pulled out some pieces of this. It was in French. Now, Russia is now reportedly capable of manufacturing 300 T-90M tanks per year. It's enough to raise concerns about the creation of a strategic reserve of armoured vehicles. This is what Mark Rutte, head of NATO, has said. From Oryx, that Russia that has lost over, they're saying 4,000 combat tanks. The authenticated irrecoverable is more like 31 or 3,200 between 22-24. By comparison, France is just over 200 operational clerks and around 400 if reserves are included. Now, as we go over, we talk about over the past 3 years, The question of tank shortage on the Russian side has been raised by many observers and used as that barometer for the end of the war. Isn't it proof the fact newer and fewer tanks are being observed at the front line? That Moscow had urgently pull its reserves of acquainted T-62s and T-54s and T-55 models. And we see even today, there was a video about this, that, these historic models are coming out. And we have said, yeah, there's many, many ways that these can still be used in warfare. These are people who've never been in infantry. You don't want to come up against armour or use as an artillery piece, or as well to use your better tanks as reserve for more breakthrough as well. What the Challenger 2 was meant to be used for until everyone figured out the Challenger 2 sort of fucking sucks. Paradoxically, another side of attrition might be hidden in the casualty figures, which tend to decrease. In the first 5 months of 2025, only 200 Russian tanks were confirmed lost, which would amount to around 480 over the year, half the yearly losses of the first 3 years of war. And this is just how the war is changing due to drones, due to mines, due to just the adaptation to how the battlefield is going. Macron, in March, gave some surprising figures. Supported by background graphics, he predicted that Russia would have 4,000 tanks in 2025 and 7,000 in 2030. But the number of operational units before the war was estimated at 3,500. How is such a gap possible, considering that the Russians have lost at least 3,000 in the same period, and where incidentally have all the Russian tanks gone? Now again, there's some suggesting that some of the numbers were incorrect. It is a fact the evolution of the war in Ukraine has pushed tanks away from the front line. Meanwhile, many countries scramble to send Ukraine tanks like Australia is doing with Abrams. The combination of battlefield's transparency and lethality of weapons due to drone warfare created a tactical blockage. Today, any concentration of tanks near the front would be immediately detected and destroyed. So it's moved to light cavalry tactics, mass deployment, motorcycles, quads, buggies that we actually see. And as I've said, would you rather, you and your section, you and your boys, go on 10 motorcycles to a line or one BMP that could be targeted? It's how things are changing. Yes, it is costly. I think less costly, and I think the numbers support that it was less costly. And I don't see how people suggest it's going to go, if offensive, go the other way. Fewer tanks, fewer losses, but Russian production is accelerating. This trend raises fears of strategic reserves of tanks that Russian forces are keeping in the rear, ready to be used one day to exploit a breakthrough in the event of a localized front collapse. And this is something which we may see, we're not really sure, but we hear more and more talking about. There could be a collapse in a localized area, and at that point we could actually see deep maneuver warfare occurring. We talk about this with then the inheriting of Soviet-era stockpiles, and that many more might have actually been sitting in reserve. And CIT says 7,300 tanks were visually confirmed in stock before the invasion. Fewer than 3,500 of those remain. In 24 alone, 1,100, 1,200 tanks were pulled from storage. At this pace, it is reasonable to assume Russia will exhaust its tank reserves ready for service by the end of 25. We were then in 23, then 24, maybe 25, we'll see. And you've got to remember, though, these old tanks are being replaced with much newer, more capable in some actions. But as I've said, I haven't seen the cost of something like a T90 versus the actual battlefield effect over a much cheaper, more numerous variant. Again, I think in where a T-54 is going to have a very similar fate to a T-90 or an Abrams or whatever. A Leopard 1 is going to have a similar fate to a Leopard 2A6 of drones on the front line. Again, more effort, I think, will actually be put into mass and keep some high end for then localized breakthroughs. Again, a senior French officer, an expert in the conflict, is more cautious, reminding that International Institute for Strategic Studies estimated in 21 that Russia had 12,000 tanks in reserve, though that figure excluded some types like the T-62, which have reappeared by the hundreds on the battlefield. So saying before this, significantly more. What we do know is the equipment in reserve or that was left over from the Soviet Union was absolutely massive. Increased production. How could Russia's tank stock continue to grow as Macron warned? Now, decisive factors. That there are half the amount of losses, and this is due to it's due to not only resistance on the battlefield, but also the way they're being used and change of tactics. Stockpiles, old Soviet stockpiles, especially if underestimated, they could last longer. And also, a lot of these are sent back to repairs and can have many lives, as they say, so that you may have a loss that's counted and it's being repaired and sent back. Particularly, T90M production Russia's newest produced tank. They operate 24/7 of the factories producing these. In 24, 280 T90s were produced, and in 25, they're seeing 300 per year, with only 60 to 70 made in 2022, which, I don't know, it must be a new batch of washing machines come through. Despite losing 130 to 140 T90Ms so far, which is 6 to 7% in total, losses in 25 have slowed to just around 3 per month. This French officer summarised each month the Russian T90M stock increases by about 20 units. So they're in positive rate of this. Older refurbished tanks are now produced at twice the rate of losses, roughly 500 per year. So growing in this as well. A total yearly production is around 1,500 tanks, 300 new, 1,200 refurbished since 25 begun. Russia's already added at least 500 tanks, including more than 100 T90Ms. It is very likely Russia is reconstituting a strategic reserve. Now, this is one thing that some NATO leaders have warned us, is that these aren't for the war in Ukraine. Therefore, after, I think it's more rebuilding that reserve. They're not going to be used at all, actually. That it's more of a future deterrence. But we may, if we see a breakthrough, and a collapse somewhere, that's where we could go wrong, and you might clip that and be like, look at this knob. Hold 5 minutes loss. On the Ukrainian side, losses seem smaller at first glance. Now, this data is every loss that was unclear. There's a tank with no turret and it tracks on the ground. That was then counted as Russian. So we know that any unclear was then just, yep, that was definitely, there's definitely a Russian one. So yeah, the numbers are always going to be skewed. Roughly 4 times fewer than Russia, but Ukraine produces no new tanks and hasn't received Western tanks since the summer of 23. Counter-offensive, apart from a batch of 49 Abrams from Australia in May. Now, I think there has been some since then, but still, we know these ones are coming through. And as I've said, the time for this is well past of tanks. That funding surely could have been spent somewhere significantly more effective for the battlefield. Ukrainian tank attrition exceeds 1/3, and for the German Leopard 2s, over 50%. According to a French military source, the source recently observed the loss of 3 Ukrainian T-72s of the Ural type, a 1970s era model, which has never seen lost in combat before. It's a strong negative signal that suggests Ukraine is forced to field its older tanks. Proof again that Ukraine's war has become one of attrition. No shit, increasingly favouring Russia, whose resources may be limited but are depleting more slowly than Ukraine's. What is true for tanks also applies to armoured vehicles and artillery. Yes, this is what we talk about. You are attriting yourself in attritional warfare, but your goal is to attrit them faster. On drones, once a Ukrainian advantage, the trend is also reversing. In June, Russians expected to fire over 5,000 Garand drones. Yes, the drone advantage Ukraine had then became parity, and now I would say Russia holds now the drone advantage, and probably has for some times. Again, like I said, fog of war, once you're well past, becomes clear when you look back. At a recent French Assembly hearing, General Thierry Burkhardt, and warned that Russia might hold 5 minutes longer than us. Despite a very complicated situation, he added, "We must break the linearity of the battlefield to avoid strategic defeat turning into a Russian victory, with consequences we can only imagine." So, as I've spoken about before, reintroduction of manoeuvre and not the linearity of the war. Again, with the complications around armoured movements, drones and mines and the Russian defensive lines, I don't see how that's going to be possible, given does Ukraine have the ability to reconstitute a large offensive force? Again, the current force, which is running full tilt to recruit and conscript everyone that they can, it's struggling to hold the line and isn't holding the line in many areas, let alone building a reserve of tens of thousands of guys trained and fitted out, ready to go on offensive actions. That's what you were talking about here, to go on. And this is where, since 2020, the best chance was 23 counter-offensive. And once that then failed, there should have been further actions then made. I think that's what we'll look back on. He highlighted tactical gridlock and noted, although Russians advance 20 kilometres per day, it is slow grinding. Large-scale manoeuvres are currently impossible. They're currently impossible. I believe may be impossible into the future, but we will see. Now, the danger of an attritional war is that the front could collapse. And we always realise it too late in this type of conflict, from this historian comparing to World War I. And in such a collapse, tanks may once again take centre stage. And this is potentially what they're looking at, is we have a huge reserve of top-end manoeuvrable tanks like T90s with a whole bunch of less important refurbished tanks, and if there is a breakthrough in an area, to be able to push far, far deeper and exploit that shortage of forces. And what I've spoken about is, what if that happens? What is then the plan for negotiations? What if next thing the Russians, instead of 20 kilometers squared per day, what if we see a day where there's a 20 kilometer advance somewhere? What then is the plan? Because once that momentum starts going, the oil tanker attrition is going to be very, very hard to stop. And this is why many have said it will go until physical borders. This is why this down here was very important around Dashnay, and why some still suggest that the Dnieper River is going to become then a border. I don't know, but we will continue waiting to see. But the oil tanker attritional warfare is very, very hard to turn around once momentum has started going one way. And you can see this, the reason I bring this up, of the reality of what is occurring, what we see from Sumy to other areas, as well as on the diplomatic front, and then building strategic reserves and being able to do that as well. Legends, I hope that you have a fantastic day, and I will speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.